And we are live. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Mishnah Mastery. And welcome to our global live virtual studio audience. Wonderful to have you all on board. And let's crack on with Maseches Bava Batra, chapter 3 and chapter 4. I don't think I mentioned this, by the way, but Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, Bava Basra, the first gate, the middle gate, and the end gate. And each of those have 10 chapters in them. So historically, it would seem that they were actually all one Masechta, and they got divided into three. And they got divided into three Masechtas of 10 chapters each. So originally it was one big book of 30 chapters. So I guess it's a bit of a relief that we only have to do 10 at a time, because you set yourself smaller targets and you feel more accomplished. So here we go. We are going to crack on and dive straight in to chapter 3. Going to do my best. Not everything is easy, but I will do my best to take us through it. So without further ado, here we go with Perek Gimel. Perek Gimel, we are talking about chazakah. A chazakah is essentially a claim to a piece of land, a piece of property. And fundamentally, the halacha says that if you have 3 years uncontested ownership of a property, then you are deemed to have a chazakah. And that would mean that it would come under your full halachic ownership unless something was to be proven otherwise. So, for example, if a squatter was to claim a piece of land, if they have no proof, they have no documentation, but they have had 3 consistent years without complaint or interruption, then that would be proof enough instead of a shtar. So the Mishnah says in chapter 3, Mishnah Aleph, Chezkas habatim v'haboros v'hashichin v'hama'aros v'hashevachos v'hamechartzaos uveis habadin uveis hashlachin v'ha'avadim v'chol shehu oseh peros tadeh chezkasan shalosh shanim miyom liyom. Essentially, the following things are going to generate a chazakah if they go uncontested and the person has usage and ownership over these things for 3 years consecutively. So let's go through it slowly. Chezkas habatim, to get a chazakah on a house. V'haboros, or on pits. V'hashichin, or on ditches. V'hama'aros, or on caves. V'hashovachos, or on dovecots, or birds' cages. V'hamechartzaos, or on bathhouses. Ubeis habadin, on olive presses. Ubeis hashlachin, or on irrigated fields. V'ha'avadim, or over servants. V'chol shehu oseh peros tadeh, or anything which constantly generates profits. Says the Mishnah, Chezkasan shalosh shanim miyom liyom. To get a chazakah over these things, you have to have 3 years constantly uncontested ownership. Says the Mishnah, Sdei habal, when it comes to fields which are not irrigated, they get watered by rain. Then the Mishnah says, Chezkasa shalosh shanim ve'einat tzricha miyom liyom. Then it's still 3 years, but it's not miyom liyom. It doesn't have to have been day to day, because you don't go in and work on them day to day. So that's the first opinion on the Mishnah with regards to these kinds of fields that don't require constant supervision and constant work. Gesundheit. Okay, continues the Mishnah. Rabbi Yishmael Omer, Shlosha Chadashim Barashana, Ushlosha Ba'acharona, Ushnei Asar Chodesh Be'emtza, Harei Shmona Asar Chodesh. Rabbi Yishmael said, you do need 3 years to achieve a chazakah, but we consider part of a year as a year. So grains will often take 3 months to ripen. So Rabbi Yishmael says, if you've had uncontested usage of the land for 3 months, and then 12 months consecutively, and then a further 3 months, it's considered as if you have had 3 years worth of supervision or of ownership, even though in total you'll have only spent 18 months. Rabbi Akiva Omer Chodesh B'Roshona v'Chodesh B'Acharona Shnei Masar Chodesh B'Emtza Harei Arba Asar Chodesh. Rabbi Akiva is more lenient, and he judges it by the cycle of vegetable growth, which may take 1 month. So if you've had 1 month uncontested, that will count as your first year. Then you'll have a full year, then a further month, which will be considered your third year. Despite it only having been 14 months, you will have achieved your chazaka for uncontested usage. Excuse me. Amar Rabbi Yishmael, Bamed Dvarim Amurim. Rabbi Yishmael says, what are we dealing with here when we're talking about the need to have 18 months? That is Bistei Lavan. That's with a grain field. Aval Bistei Ilam, but with a field of trees, an orchard. Kanas es Tevuasa, Masak es Zesav, Kanas es Ketza, Harei Elu Shalosh Shanim. Says Rabbi Yishmael that if the person has gathered in his produce, or he has harvested his olives, or he has gathered in his dates, this is going to be considered 3 years. So if he has harvested 3 types of produce, then that's going to be equivalent to having had uncontested ownership for 3 years. So that could be much quicker than 3 years. It could be much quicker than 14 months. But if you have harvested 3 times, even if it's different produce, it's going to be a chazaka according to Rabbi Shmuel. Mishnah Base, we're going to see that the chazaka is only going to work if the owner was in the same region during the time of the chazaka and didn't object. So the Mishnah says, Shalosh aratzos lechazaka. There are 3 separate regions in Eretz Yisrael with regards to being able to to establish a chazaka. Yehuda ve'ever hayarden v'hagalil, the area of Judah, the area of Transjordan, and the area of the Galilee. Haya beYehuda ve'hechezek beGalil. If the owner was in Judea, and the person who's trying to establish ownership is on his farm in the Galil, or beGalil ve'hechezek beYehuda, or vice versa, the owner is currently living in the Galil, and you're trying to take over his land, which is in Judea, ain't a chazaka. You're not going to be able to establish a chazaka ad shehei imo b'medina, until he is in the same province as you, and could therefore go and contest if he was to find out that you were occupying his land. Amar Rabbi Yehuda says, Lo amru shalosh shanim ele kadei shehei ba'aspamia. Rabbi Yehuda says the only reason why the halacha says that the chazaka has to take 3 years is because you could be as far away as Spain. The owner could be as far away as Spain, and you're occupying the land in Eretz Yisrael, in which case, v'yachazik shan, it's going to take a year for the news to spread that someone is squatting on his land. V'yelchu v'yodiyu shana, and then you're going to need to take a year for someone to come and inform you that that someone's on your land. V'yavo l'shana acheres, and then it takes you a year to get back and take the person to court for having occupied your land. So that's the 3-year chazaka. 1 year for news to travel, 1 year for the people to travel to you to tell you that someone's on your land, and a further year to travel back and take the guy to court. That's why the chazaka lasts for 3 years. Mishnah Gimel, the person must have some kind of claim to ownership. They can't just squat. So we're going to see that there are 4 counterclaims that a person could make. If the owner was to say, hey, you're on my property, there can be 4 valid counterclaims. Number 1, the person can say, what do you mean? You sold it to me. I just don't have the proof. I don't have the documentation, but I've lived here for 3 years uncontested, so now it's my land. Number 2, you gave it to me as a gift. You gave it to me as a matana. I don't have proof of it, but I've been here 3 years and you've not kicked up a fuss. Number 3, your father sold it to me. I don't have proof of it, but I've been here for 3 years. You've not said a thing. Number 4, your father gave it to me and you've not said a thing. So those are the 4 counterclaim. Says the Mishnah, Kol chazaka she'ein ima tana. Any chazaka claim which does not have it with it a claim of this nature, eina chazaka, you won't be able to establish the ownership. Ketzad, how? What is the case? Amalo, ma ta oseh b'toch sheli. What are you doing on my property? V'hu amar lo, shelo amar li adam davar me'olam eina chazaka. Well, no one's ever said anything to me, so I'm in possession of the land. So that is eina chazaka. That's not going to be enough to get you the presumptive ownership of the land. But if you respond and say, Shemachartali, what do you mean? You sold it to me, don't you remember? Shinatatali b'matani, gave it to me as a gift. Avicha machrali, your father sold it to me. Avicha nasnali b'matani, your father gave it to me as a gift. Harei zo chazaka, then you would be able to establish presumptive ownership over this property. Continues the Mishnah, Vaba mishum Yerusha einat tzarich tana, that if a person comes to claim the land based on inheritance, they do not need a claim explaining why their ancestors would have had a right to the land. Meaning, if you inherit a chazaka, so if you inherit land from someone who was establishing a chazaka over it, he doesn't need to know what his father's claim would have been, because we can presume that his father didn't steal it. So if you inherited land which later someone tried to claim, you had no proof of the ownership, but the father was there for 3 years, you've been there, you've inherited this land, you don't need to be able to establish what the terms of the condition was when your father took ownership. Continues the Mishnah, Ha'umanim, if you have craftsmen working in the field and taking produce from the field, V'hashutafim, if you have partners of a field, V'ha'arisim, you have sharecroppers, if you have apotropin, if you have people who are kind of guardians over orphans who are working in this field, Ein lahem chazaka, they are not going to be able to establish presumptive ownership of a property, because there is reasonable reason for them to have been there, and there would have been reasonable reason, therefore, for an owner to never contest that they were working or they were trying to take ownership over the field. So it has to be someone who has a complete disconnect to the land, who is claiming that they have ownership of the land. A husband cannot establish a chazaka over his wife's property, and a wife can't do that for her husband's property, because it's reasonable that these people are going to be in each other's properties, and so that can't be used as proof that you have established your own ownership over their land. They wouldn't have kicked up a fuss because it's expected to see them there. A father's not going to be able to do it over his son's property, and a son's not going to be able to do it over his father's property. Asks the Mishnah, what are we talking about over here? What's the case? Says the Mishnah, that it's said in a case of one who has mere possession of the property. So in lieu of documentation, that's what we're talking about. But with regards to gifting property, or brothers who have divided up property, or somebody who is establishing possession over property of a convert who died and didn't have any heirs. If you went and you locked the door, you went and you fenced up the field, you went and you breached the fence for whatever reason, even just a bit, this is going to be considered taking possession of the property. You're going to have a chazaka even without the waiting period that we've been talking about. Mishnah Dalet. Says the Mishnah, if you have two witnesses who come and say that you have been profiting from the field for 3 years, but they are found to be false. They are found to be collaborators who are conspiring to be able to effect an outcome in a court of law, but they're doing so under false pretenses. We will learn more about Eidim Zomimin in Maseches Makos, where there's a whole process to be able to prove that people are conspiring witnesses. But essentially, the punishment for conspiring witnesses is they are supposed to be punished to the same extent that they were trying to cause the loss of the other person. So, for example, we'll see in Maseches Makos, if someone was testifying that someone committed a crime which would justify the death penalty, and then they're found to have been conspiring, both of those witnesses are going to be liable to the death penalty in that person's place. So in this case, they're conspiring to say that this person is going to have ownership of the field. There's just one problem. You're gypping the owner of the field by saying this new guy has a chazaka. He might have only been there for 5 minutes, but you're coming along and saying that he's been there for 3 years. So the punishment is Mishalmin lo es hakol. The Adim are going to have to pay the original owner the full value of the field. In that way, because they were trying to deprive the original owner of the true value of the field. What if Shnaim barishona ushnaim bashnia ushnaim bashlishis? What if you have 2 witnesses who testify that you were there for the first year, 2 witnesses to testify that you were there for the second year, and 2 witnesses to testify that you were there for the third year? So in that instance, you're depriving the owner of the full value, but you're depriving the owner of the full value of the field, but you're only contributing a third. Would you excuse me just one moment? Enough, Daniel. You're depriving the person of the full owner, but you, as a witness testifying over 1 year, are only depriving him of a third of the value. So the Mishnah says, Meshalshin beinehem, the value of the field is going to be divided up 3 ways between these witnesses. So each of those pairs are going to be paying a third of the true value of the field. It says the Mishnah, Shlosha achim ve'echad mitzdaref imayim. If you have 3 brothers who testify of the course of 3 years, and on each occasion, ve'echad mitzdaref imayim, and the same witness combines with those 3 brothers across those 3 years, hare elu shalosh ediyos, that becomes 3 distinct sets of witnesses. V'hein edus achas lahazama. And it's going to mean that it becomes one testimony for the purpose of rendering them as conspiring witnesses, and so the payment is going to be divided amongst them. So the one witness is going to pay half, and the 3 brothers are going to pay the other half. But all of the witnesses have to be found to be conspiring. They have to be zoning, otherwise the case will just fall through. More on that, as I said, once we get to Masechet Makot. Mishnah Hey. Elu dvarim sheyesh lahem chazaka ve'elu dvarim she'ein lahem chazaka. Which usages can amount to be to establish a chazaka? So these are the things, these are the uses of property that can bring about a chazaka, and these are the ones that can't. Hayamamid v'hema b'chatzer. If you have put your animal in a courtyard, or tanur, you put your oven, v'chiraim, or your stovetops, or v'reichaim, your millstone, umigadel tanagolim, or you're raising chickens, v'nosen zivlo b'chatzer, or you put your fertilizer in a courtyard, ein chazaka. These things are not going to be sufficient to establish the presumptive ownership of the field. Aval asam chitza levehem to gavor hasar tefachim. But if you go and construct a partition 10 tefachim high for the sake of your animal inside this courtyard, v'chein letano, or partitions around an oven, v'chein kirayim, or for the stove, v'chein lerechaim, for the millstone, hichnis tarnagolen letoch habayis, so you start bringing your chickens into the house, or you create a space in this in the ground of the courtyard of 3 tefachim depth to be able to put the fertilizer, or gavoha shlosha, or the fertilizer is 3 tefachim high, harei zo chazaka. Then these actions are going to be sufficient to establish a chazaka over the place. Mishnah Vav is going to discuss usages that neighbors would allow or not allow each other. And the presumption here is that if the neighbors have not complained, it's because we assume that the neighbors were mochel. We assume that they did not wish to complain and they were happy with the usage that this person was establishing. It says the Mishnah, Hamar zev ein lo chazaka. When it comes to a small gutter, a small pipe that takes water from the roof, which can be repositioned in different places to allow water to flow from the roof in different places. So v'yesh limekomo chazaka. So if you have got this small pipe, Hamar zev ein lo chazaka. The small pipe is not going to be sufficient to establish as a chazaka, to be able to keep it there. V'yesh limekomo chazaka. But he does have the ability to acquire the place or acquire the privilege with regards to its place as a chazaka, which gets explained in the Gemara. Hamazchila yesh la chazaka, a big gutter, a long pipe which can't tilt or bend or move without permission. The gutter pipe that goes along the length of the roof, yesh la chazaka. There, you're going to be able to establish a chazaka over that if you keep it there for a long period of time. Sulama mitzri ein lo chazaka. If you put an Egyptian ladder which is small and portable, which people aren't going to object to, then you can't establish a chazaka. V'latzori yesh lo chazaka. But a big ladder which is fixed, a Syrian ladder which is large and fixed in place, which people would complain about if they didn't like it there, yesh lo chazaka. Then you could claim a chazaka if no one complains. Chalon ha-mitzris ein lo chazaka, a small Egyptian window which isn't big enough to get a person's head through, as we'll see, but it's overlooking into someone else's courtyard. So the Mishnah says, ein la chazaka, you won't be able to establish a chazaka for that just because no one complained. V'latzoris yesh la chazaka. But for a Tyrian window, which is larger and could be more obstructive and could block out, could create privacy issues or potentially be an issue for blocking light, etc., etc. So yesh la chazaka. If that goes uncontested, then you're going to have the chazaka to be able to keep it there. Ezohi chalon mitzvahs. What is an Egyptian window? Answers the Mishnah. Kosh ein rosha shel adam yachal likanes lesocha. Any window that is so small that a person's head cannot fit through it. Rabbi Yehuda says, however, im yesh la malben, if the window has a frame, making it more of a significant structure despite the size. Even though a person can't fit his head through, that is going to be cause for establishing a chazaka because it's more substantial. And despite the size, if your neighbors don't complain about it, they must be okay with you having it there. Haziz ad tefach yesh la chazaka. When it comes to a ledge protruding from your property, until a tefach you can acquire chazaka v'yachol limchos, and the ledge owner can stop the wall owner negating the ledge by removing it or building over it at the same height. So you can prevent someone from now interfering with what you have built. Pachot mitefach, but if it's less than a tefach, ein lo chazaka, you don't have a chazaka, ve'ein yachol limchos, and you wouldn't be able. The owner of the courtyard would not be able to protest the construction. So 1 second, let's just check that again. A projection coming from a person's house, which is at least a tefach, I think, as far as a tefach, then the owner of the courtyard can protest. But if it's less, then the owner of the house cannot have a chazaka over it, and the owner of the courtyard cannot protest its construction. I don't think I said that correctly. I'm sorry. Mishnah Zayin. Mishnah Zayin, where we talk about neighbors' rights. So the Mishnah says, Lo yiftach adam chalonosav lechatzar shutafim. Person may not build openings for windows that overlook a shared courtyard space. So you can't add more entrances or add more windows. Lakach bayes bechatzer acheres. If you go and buy a house in another courtyard somewhere, you can't start creating more entrances that go into the shared courtyard space. Bana aliyah al gabe besa. If you build a higher floor on top of your house, lo yiftachena lechatzar shutafin. You can't now create an entrance directly from the courtyard into this upper room. Elohim ratza, but if you would like, bona es hacheder lifnim besa. You can build the room inside your house. Bena aliyah al gabe besa, and then you can build the loft on top of your house. And then you can have the entrance to this room entering into your house. You just can't do it into shared courtyard space. Lo yiftach adam lechatzar shutafim pesach keneged pesach v'chalon keneged chalon. You have to be careful with the way you build your windows and your doors in a shared courtyard space. So you can't have windows facing your neighbor's windows and doorways facing your neighbor's doorways because of privacy. Hayakatan lo yasein gadol. If you had a small entrance or window, you can't now start making it bigger. Echad lo yasein shnayim. If you had one doorway, you can't now turn it into two. Aval posech hu l'reshus harabim. Pesach keneged pesach v'chalon keneged chalon. But if it's opening up, overlooking the public domain, then you can have a doorway facing another person's doorway and a window facing another person's window. Hayakatan osa gadol. If it was a small door, you can make it larger. And echad osa shnaim. And if it was one, then you can make it two. Mishnah Ches. To finish off the third chapter for this evening. Ein osin cholol tachas reshus harabim. You have to be careful not to weaken the ground of reshus harabim. So you can't excavate an opening underneath the public domain. So you can't dig burrows, shichin umaros. You can't dig pits or ditches or caves. Rabbi Eliezer martir kadesha tehayagala ma'alech chesed tuna abanim. Rabbi Eliezer says, as long as you've left enough support for the road to be able to sustain the weight of a wagon driver heavily loaded, then you can dig underneath there. So I guess modern day equivalent, digging tunnels for the London Underground underneath city streets. As long as you've kept everything, the infrastructure strong enough to support the load of everything that needs to go over it, you'd be allowed to. You can't have ledges and balconies protruding over reshus harabim, public domain. But if you want, you can create an intrusion into your own property. So you can build into your property balconies which overlook reshus harabim, but you can't have balconies that extend over the valid space that you were allocated. But obviously, if you bought property which had ledges and balconies which were overlooking these things, then then you would have presumptive ownership over those things, because we would presume that the previous owners were not thieves. And so if you're buying property like that, we would assume that it's legitimate. And with that, we say Mazel Tov on completing chapter 3. Everyone ready for chapter 4? Here we go. Chapter 4, we're going to be discussing what gets included in a sale. So we're going to look at different things that would get sold, and what things would be assumed to have been included, and what things would not have been included. And fundamentally, if you don't specify what you are selling, then it's not going to include anything which functions independently of the thing that you are buying. So the Mishnah says, Hamocher Sabai is a person selling a house, Lo Macha Hayatzia. You won't include naturally the small room connected to the house, which would have a separate function. On the screen there, it translates it as an extension built above or alongside the main building, even if it opens into the property. Nor would it include what I've translated as the garage behind the house, but a room behind the house. Nor would it include the roof space if there is a rail, a protective fence, which is 10 tefachim high. Rabbi Yehuda says, im yesh lo tzuras pesach, if the if the rooftop perimeter has a doorway, even if it was, even if the barrier around it was 10 tefachim high, it wouldn't be included in the sale. And the assumption, according to Rabbi Yehuda, is that if these owners have built a door frame into this structure around the roof, it must mean that they must have had separate usage. So unless these things are explicitly included in the sale, then they won't be otherwise included. Mishnah Base, lo esabor v'lo esadus. It would not include, if you were selling a house, it would not include the pit, nor would it include the outside cistern. Afalpi shekasav lo unka v'ruma. Even though in the terms of sale, you would have written that it includes all the depth and all of the height of the property. Pits and cisterns have to be explicitly mentioned in order for them to be included. And since there are going to be things that don't get sold intuitively with the rest of the property, but tzarich likach lo derech divrei Rabbi Akiva, the seller has to buy the rights of access. So even though there are things which won't be sold, Rabbi Akiva says he must buy the rights of access because he has sold the trespassing rights. And so the seller sells graciously, but nonetheless he's going to have to buy these things. Says the Chachamim. Chachamim Omrim einot tzarich likach lo derech. The Chachamim say that we would assume that the seller intended to hold back his access privileges. Continues the Mishnah, Rabbi Akiva would agree though. At a time when the seller says to the buyer that it excludes things like the pit and the cistern, then the Mishnah would say, then Rabbi Akiva would agree, then Rabbi Akiva would agree that he wouldn't need to buy the access. If you then go and sell the property onwards, Rabbi Akiva Omer einot tzarich likach lo derech. Rabbi Akiva says that you don't need to go and buy the access. But Chachamim Omerim tzarich likach lo derech. But the Chachamim say he would need to buy the access. So my apologies. Let's just rephrase that. He sold the property to one guy, but then he sold the pit and the cistern to somebody else. So in that instance, Rabbi Akiva says the buyer would not need to purchase access, but the Chachamim would say he would need to purchase access. And the assumption here is, according to Rabbi Akiva, since the seller sells ba'ayin yafeh with a good eye, it's going to include the access. And the Chachamim says, since the seller would sell ba'ayin ra'ah, he would typically try to jip wherever possible, make a good deal for himself. So according to the Chachamim, then you would need to buy the access rights. Mishnah Gimel, going to be talking about items that are attached to the house and are used as parts of the house, and whether or not they will be included in the sale. Says the Mishnah, Hamocher Sabayis, you sell a house, Machar Sadeles. This includes the door of Allah es mafteach, but would not include the key. And that's because the key is portable. So the assumption, we're talking about assumptions here, the assumption would be that the key was not included. I can't imagine that would fly very well nowadays. Continues the Mishnah. Machar esamach teshes hakavua. If a person sells a fixed grinder, you sell the house. Machar esamach teshes hakavua. It's going to include the fixed grinder. Avalo es hamital teles, but it's not going to include the portable grinder. Machar es ha'itzdrabal, it will included in the sale will be the bottom base of the millstone of Allah es hakeles, but not the more portable funnel or upper stone, which the grain gets poured through. Velo es hatana, and it would not include the ovens. Velo es hakirayim, it would not include the stoves. But machar tanur, machar kirayim. But if you were to sell as part of the deal the oven, that would include the stovetops as well. Bizman sha'amar lo hu v'chol ma shebasoicha. But if you said as part of the sale it's going to be the property and everything in it, Hare chulan mechur, and then everything in it is going to be sold. It's going to be sold fully furnished. Mishnah Dalet. What's included in the sale of a chatzer? Excuse me. Hamocher es a chatzer machabatim. If you sell the courtyard, then the intention is to sell the houses as well, and boros shichin ma'aros, and the pits and the ditches and the caves of Allah metaltalin, but nothing portable or movable. But if they said this and everything in it, hare chula mechor, and then everything is sold. Whichever way round the arrangements have been made, whether with explicitly selling things or not, it would not include the bathhouse, or the olive press that's in the courtyard. Those things would have to be even more specifically stated. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Rabbi Eliezer says, if the person just said, I'm going to sell you the courtyard, all is really guaranteeing is the airspace of the courtyard, but nothing found in it or connected to it. Let the buyer beware. Mishnah Hay, talking about selling an olive press. Only the parts that are attached to the olive press are going to be included in the sale. Hamocher es beis habad, a person selling an olive press, machar es hayam. It's going to include the yam, which is the pool, the main vat. Ve'es hamatmal, and the pounding stone. Ve'es habasulos, and the poles, which are immovable. But it's not going to include the beams, ve'es hagalgal, or the wheel, ve'es hakora, or the main pressing beam. But if he says this and everything in it, then everything will be sold. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Rabbi Eliezer says if you sell an olive press, of course you're going to be selling the Pakora as well, even though it might not be permanently attached. It's the main part of the press because that's what you use to crush the olives with, so that's going to be included in the sale. Mishnah Vav, selling a bathhouse. If a person sells a bathhouse, it doesn't include the beams, the boards that are placed on the floor, there's a safsalim, or the benches, ve'es ha-vilaos, or the curtains. Interesting, it translates safsalim on the screen there as basins, but a safsal is usually a bench, so let's just have a quick look. Yeah, benches. I'm not sure why it translates it as basins. At a time when it says, I sell you this and everything in it, then everything's sold. But whether that is said or not, it's not going to include the reservoir of water, the tanks of water, nor will it include the storehouses for wood, because you would need something more explicit to be able to get those included in the sale. Mishnah Zion, selling the city. Someone who sells a city. Not quite sure how this would manifest, but there we go. Someone who sells a city. Machabatim sells the houses. Boros shichin ma'aros, the pits, ditches, and caves. Mechatzoros for shovachos. It includes the bathhouses and the dovecots. Beis habadin and beis hashlachin. It includes the olive presses and the irrigated fields. But nothing which is movable or portable. I sell you this and everything in it. Even if there were animals and slaves, all of that gets included. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says if you sell the city, you get the senator of the city along with it. Look at that word, santar, senator. Mishnah Ches, you are trying to sell a field. Hamocher es ha-sadeh, one who's selling a field. Macher es ha-avanim shehem netzarka. Included within the sale are going to be any stones which are needed for the field and which are used in the field. Ves ha-kanim shebakerem shehem netzarka. And any reeds in the vineyard that are useful. Ves ha-tavua shehi mechuberes lekarka. And any produce which is still connected to the ground. And any enclosed areas with reeds that are up to 104 and 1/6 amot squared, which is the minimum size for a garden. So all of those spaces are going to be assumed to be part of the field that you are selling and not independent fields or gardens in their own right. Continues the Mishnah. And any temporary guard huts which have not been plastered with cement, and sycamore trees, a charav is a carob tree which has not yet been grafted, so it's still very weak. And any sycamore trees which have not yet been trimmed and not had any wood cut yet, so they're going to be very inferior, and they are going to be included in the sale. It's not cold. Mishnah test. It's not cold. But it wouldn't include stones which are not useful to the property, to the field. And it wouldn't include any reeds of the vineyard which are not useful to the vineyard. It wouldn't include produce which is detached and harvested from the ground. But if he said it includes everything, then these things would be included. But whether this way or that way, it wouldn't include any fenced off areas that are larger than a base rava, because these are going to be assumed to be or considered to be a separate field. And it's not going to include any guard huts that have been plastered with clay. And it's not going to include carob trees which have been grafted, which would make them much stronger. Not with regrown sycamore trunks. And it's not going to include pits, gas, or wine presses, or dovecots, whether they are populated or not. Rabbi Akiva says that the seller who's going to still have access to these different things, according to Rabbi Akiva, is going to need to buy rights of access. The Chachamim say he does not need to. It's going to be assumed. In murder Rabbi Akiva would agree. That if he explicitly said that this sale is going to exclude these specific things, then he's not going to need to buy access rights. If you then go and sell these other things to someone else, Rabbi Akiva would assume that the seller is doing this with a good eye, and he therefore does not need to go and buy the rights. We're going to assume the seller was trying to get a good deal for himself, and therefore he would need to buy access rights. What are we talking about over here? We're talking about when it is the seller. So what's the case when we say that these things are excluded? It's with regards to someone who's selling the field, where again you're going to have trying to get a good deal for yourself. But if you're giving all of this away as a gift, no sen es kulam, then everything would be included, because there, when you're giving a gift, you're assumed to be giving with a good eye. Brothers who are dividing up property, zachu v'sadeh, zachu v'chulam. If they inherit the field as part of their inheritance, then they acquire all of the things that we've been mentioning that would get included in the field. And if a person is taking possession of the property of a convert, so if you took over a convert's field and they had died without any heirs, then you're going to take ownership as well of all of those things inside the field. One who consecrates his field to the Beis HaMikdash, which again we assume is going to be done by ayin yafeh, with a good eye, generous eye. Hikdish es kulam, it's going to include everything. that gets consecrated to the Beit HaMikdash. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Hamakdish es hasada, one who consecrates the field, Lo hikdish elai sacharov hamurkav vesadan hashikma. It says Rabbi Shimon is only going to include grafted carob trees and strong replanted sycamore trunks. I think because I'm not sure exactly the reason why. Oh, that's anticlimactic. So Rabbi Shimon says, out of all those additional things that we had mentioned that would get included with, or wouldn't get included with the field, Rabbi Shimon says it's only going to include the trees. It's not going to include the pits and the ditches and all of that kind of thing. Because Rabbi Shimon says the mindset of someone who consecrates to the Beit HaMikdash is going to be similar to the mindset of a seller trying to sell their field, and therefore is not going to be mukdish, he's not going to consecrate all of those things, but the trees, the strong trees, would be included. And with that we say Mazel Tov on completing chapter 4 of Maseches Batra, and that's all we've got time for this evening. Mazel Tov, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you all, please God, next time on Mishnah Mastery.